Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Impact and Coffee, our first one on June 2nd, 2020. I'm Robert Nelson. I'm the program manager for the Grants Collective, and my co-host this morning is always...
Multitasking. Good morning, this is Mariah. We're happy to have you.
Awesome. We have a very special Impact and Coffee this morning. We are actually extending until 10:30 this morning. So we have a very special panel to talk about the special session that's happening on June 18th of this month with our state legislature. And so we have a great group of panelists this morning from all over the nonprofit sector doing some really amazing stuff. Mariah, can you talk a little bit about what Impact and Coffee is?
Sure, yeah. I'm not going to get it right word for word, but Impact and Coffee is a welcome opening space for us in the nonprofit community to talk about what's happening in our organizations, to have some of the hard conversations, some of the hard questions asked, and to share what's innovative and some of our challenges so that we can ideally work together and share some resources in the work that we do. That's about Impact and Coffee.
You know, it's also Gratitude Tuesday today, Mariah. Is there anything you wanted to share before we get started?
I think I'll keep it simple by saying I'm so grateful for everybody that's been walking on our streets the last couple of days protesting against the political and social and economic injustices against our Black community locally and nationally.
Thanks, Mariah. I appreciate it. I know it's tough out there right now. I know I'm hurting like a lot of other folks. If you have anything that you're grateful in the chat, please say so. I also just want to say, too, that, you know, it's not just George Floyd. There are other people out there who've been suffering in our Black communities for a long time, like Breonna Taylor, who didn't get reported on for ages until this week. Ahmaud Arbery, whose information was kept from us for months before anything was happening to the two men that murdered him. And even here in Albuquerque, where we have to fear the threat of police violence, especially on our protesters like last Thursday night, tear gas was rained upon peaceful protests late Thursday night and then wasn't reported on the next day. Even last night, I just want to add this. If you want to do something about this right now, support Black Lives Matter, support Black-led organizations and Black small businesses. You can also call our mayor's office and call our governor and ask them to release Clifton White. His name should be burned in your memory today because he was arrested last night for no warrant at all, mostly as retaliation for organizing Black lives. His name is Clifton White. I want y'all to remember that name. Call our governor and call our mayor to ask for his release immediately. And that's all I'll say about that. But I want to get into our panel today and actually just have, Mariah, if you want to share like a moment of silence, would you like to talk a little bit about that really quickly?
I do, and if you all will bear with me for a moment, Impact and Coffee has put together something we want to say out loud about the situation. So, as a local group of volunteers who believe in and work for social justice, each in our own ways and through several different organizations, the Impact and Coffee team would like to say that we support the family of George Floyd and those working for justice in his murder. We stand by protesters in saying that Black lives matter and that racism is very much alive in our country, directly and violently impacting the Black community. We hope this can be a turning point in our country and right here in Albuquerque, where Black voices are held up and we can work with our community leaders and elected officials toward an equality-based justice system and away from racist policies. It is important to note that COVID-19 has also amplified long-existing inequities in our health system. The fact that Black folks are only 15% of our population but are dying at the highest rate from issues related to the virus, and a classic example of social economic determinants of health. Also, today is primary voting day in New Mexico, and we would encourage you to take this opportunity to exercise your vote. In addition, to find a way to support a Black-owned business, author, or organization that supports this movement. To see the call for sustainable transformation in our communities and the demands of Black Lives Matter, you can go to their Instagram page at BLK Lives Matter. Now, if you will, please join me in that moment of silence for all those affected by police brutality and the Black people that are dead today because of it. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thanks, Mariah, and thanks everyone. We really appreciate it. So we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. On that note, we have a really great panel today. And in light of all that's happening right now, we have this really great opportunity to affect change in our communities on a broader scale. And so we've invited some very special panelists today to talk about what's happening in the next few weeks with our special session with state legislators. So we're going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, take about 2 minutes to talk about themselves and the organization, and then we'll launch into questions from there. The first person to my left is James Jimenez. Welcome, James, and good morning. Thanks for being here today.
Good morning, Robert. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for this opportunity to once again speak at Impact and Coffee. It's good to see all of you. New Mexico Voices for Children. We are a 32-year-old child advocacy organization. I want to give a shout out to our founding ED who's on the call, Una Porter, one of my very best favorite heroes in this movement. And we have been working on social justice from a child's perspective for, as I said, over 30 years. So we have a staff of 13 and facing our own challenges during this time of life in America.
Thanks, James. Really appreciate it. To my right is Terry Brunner, CEO of the Grants Collective. Welcome, Terry, and good morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to talk to everybody today. I'm Terry Brunner. I'm the CEO of the Grants Collective. We're going to have a name change on Thursday that we'll be announcing. We're rebranding. I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag just yet. But for the next couple of days, we're still the Grants Collective. And we do three things, basically. One, we train grant writers and help try to populate or increase the population of grant writers, qualified, good grant writers in the state. We have a cooperative network, web-based platform that has grant notices and best practices for grant writers, templates, useful information. And then we have our Grow New Mexico program, which provides advisory services to nonprofits and public entities to help them find the funding that they need for their projects so we can get more stuff moving in the state. So thanks again for having me today.
Thanks, Terry. Appreciate that. Right to my left, below James, is Alice Morillon. Welcome, Alice, and good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. So I'm working for the directory for Taos nonprofits. It's a very new project that I've been doing, and the idea of it is to gather resources for nonprofits here in Taos. And the goal is to improve the overall efficiency of everyone in increasing the awareness, the communication, and the collaboration between all the nonprofits. And that can apply to funding or projects led together or just advocacy. So yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you, Alice. It's good to meet you today. Right next to you is Tsiporah Nephesh over at New Mexico Thrives. Good morning, Tsiporah.
Good morning. So I'm Tsiporah, she, her, with New Mexico Thrives. And New Mexico Thrives advocates and works on behalf of the New Mexico nonprofit sector. So working to protect your ability to work and be effective, and looking out for ways that will improve things for nonprofits and therefore improve things for our communities.
Awesome, thanks, Tsiporah. And last but certainly not least is Lilly Irvin-Vitela over at New Mexico First. Welcome, Lilly. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Robert, for having me and for giving me time to be with all of you. So my name is Lilly Irvin-Vitela. I have been with New Mexico First for a little shy of a year, but I was born and raised in New Mexico and educated here. And began to raise my family here and then moved away. And when I came back home, I was looking for a way to kind of give back in all the ways that growing up in New Mexico kind of made me effective in terms of policy work in my work in other states and at the national level as well. And so New Mexico First is really committed to building civic engagement and the development of public policy. Though our organizational values happen to align with my personal values, which are policy is best made when it's made by the folks who are most impacted. That having decisions made on or for us usually doesn't serve us well, but when we are able to bring together diverse perspectives, policy is wiser, there are less damaging unintended consequences, and we have stronger relationships. So then regardless of what the particular policy issue is, we have a way to move forward with trust. And that doesn't happen unless we do the hard work of understanding where we have common ground and also where we have dissent. And so we're doing consensus in a deeper way, which is making more room for dissent, because often it points to where there's inequity and a need for systems change.
Thanks so much for that, Lilly. Welcome all of our panelists this morning. Thank you so much for being here. And welcome to all of you. Just a reminder too that if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat function. It should be below on your Zoom, the little menu bar at the bottom. And we'll do our best to lift up questions if we feel it fits in the agenda and the questions. But please ask questions if you can. Our first question this morning actually is for Alice. We wanted to make sure that we're framing some of this conversation around nonprofits and center around communities. So Alice, could you talk a little bit about what's going on in Taos, like in your area, what you're seeing from nonprofits in your area that have been affected by the pandemic?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think the impact of the pandemic has been big, but I'm new to the nonprofit community in Taos, so I haven't quite seen the difference as a thing, but I've seen the impact right now. And from what I'm hearing, there's a lot of people who are noticing how the population at risk is even more at risk right now, and it's opening even more the range of people that need help here in Taos. So the missions of the different nonprofits have been even more diversified, because there's the population that existed prior to this crisis and also the one that's actually needing more and more help and support right now. And from what I'm hearing around here, that leads to two challenges. One is the lack of visibility for the budget to come, because a lot of these organizations are relying on state and county funding, and so some of them don't have any visibility for what's going to happen. And so I think this upcoming session is going to give a lot of people some more visibility for what's coming up. There's also, I think, a need of flexibility for the different nonprofits, because the money they got for specific usage might be needed somewhere else right now. And I think that's a challenge right now, to see how the money that has come before can be used in the most efficient way currently.
Thanks, Alice, for that. I'm going to kick it over to Mariah really quickly just to ask this next question.
So this question is for all the panelists. And James, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go round about. What can we expect to see from the session, and how can nonprofit organizations advocate for communities effectively at this point?
Yeah, thanks for that, Mariah. Well, I mean, it's pretty clear that the legislature is going to have to deal with the current year's budget. You know, just as a reminder to everyone, the fiscal year ends on June 30th for the state of New Mexico, and there's probably about a $300 to $400 million shortfall in revenues compared to the budget that the legislature put together and that the governor signed just in January. So they're going to have to deal with that. Now, the projections for the coming fiscal year look pretty dire right now. So that's the bad news. So they're also going to have to think about whether or not this special session is the right time to deal with the next year's budget that starts on July 1. I'm of the mind that they don't necessarily need to rush into that. I think they need to be careful and thoughtful. Right now, our state general fund reserves are in pretty good shape compared to where they've been historically. And I think that the governor's been wise to take this on a sort of a slow, steady track and evaluate the situation as we go along. So dealing with the budget is going to be job number one, clearly, for this fiscal year and next fiscal year. You know, one of the things that I think that is really important for us in the nonprofit and particularly advocacy community to do is two things. One is to advocate for openness and transparency. during a special session, that can go very, very quickly, and they're talking about either anywhere from a 12-hour session to maybe a 2 or 3 day session. That doesn't give the public and doesn't give us much opportunity to advocate. And so it's vitally important that we make that known to the legislative leadership and to the governor's office, that openness and transparency is absolutely vital. The speaker has talked about releasing budget proposals 8 days or so ahead of time. That we think is a minimum standard that they need to meet. So that would be the first thing. The second is to recognize that there's a lot of New Mexicans who have been left out of the federal relief efforts. And these are predominantly immigrant families, but not entirely just immigrant families. These families are hurting, and it is absolutely the responsibility of our state government to step up in places where the federal government so far has failed to address the needs of the residents of our state and our country.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James. Terry, go ahead and follow up on that with your thoughts. What do we expect?
Well, I definitely agree with James's interpretation of what's going on. I would, if I was a nonprofit, I would be watching those budget numbers and see how they're shifting. We just had a conversation with one of the agencies, the state agencies, last week, and all of their programs are taking cuts, or they're being shifted around. Program money is not coming in like they anticipated. So if you're reliant on state agency funding for one of your programs, you should be watching where those numbers are all going. And I think that's something to look for. I would also look for how they are changing the programs. So, at the moment, the CDBG program, for instance, the community development block grant that usually goes to a lot of community construction projects and nonprofits and public entities. It's a HUD program. There's been a plus up in their budget that they've received from, they've received a bunch of COVID funds in that, and then they've withheld and pulled back. The state has a lot of the CDBG projects, and they put a proposal into HUD to take the CDBG program this year and turn it into a no interest loan fund for small businesses. So that they want to cobble together about 11, or I'd say maybe 10 to 15 million for that. But that means that there won't be new CDBG projects like there normally are. So, I think this session will also give us a lot of information on how the state's dealing with recovery and trying new things and putting new ideas out there, which in a lot of ways is an opportunity for the public and nonprofits and other people to step up and give the state some good ideas along the way. Unfortunately, when you have a session that's going to be as short as this one, and you're not going to have people all gathered at the Capitol like normal, it's going to be a little strange and different as far as being active and engaged as a member of the public in what they're doing. But that's even more argument to start getting in touch with your legislators now about how you feel about the issues that are out there.
Yeah, this short session and no presence is such it's a double whammy. And so, Tsiporah, if you could also address this question on what we can see. The other part of this is how can nonprofit organizations be advocating during this session?
Great. Well, I think that James and Terry have laid out a pretty good picture of what we can expect to see. And the way to advocate is now. Nonprofits need to contact their state representatives and senators and tell them about the work of your organization. Tell them what happened to your organization during the pandemic. If the demand for services increased, if you were able to pivot and work remotely, or if you weren't because of lack of broadband, or because your services don't translate to remote delivery. Let your state representative and senator know, and let them know what your financial picture is. So if your donations are down, if you've canceled a fundraising event, if your state contracts have been delayed, because some of them, the payments have been delayed, or the expectation remains in place even though the circumstances are totally different now. Let them know what's going on. When legislators don't hear from nonprofits, when they don't hear from you, they go on who they hear from and what they know. And from what I have heard of legislators, or from the things I've heard them say, they have gross misconceptions about nonprofits. So it's really important to talk to them and tell them no cuts to programs and services. The people of New Mexico, that's just hurt upon hurt if they do that. They need to find other places to cut, not to programs and services. So that would be my message, mostly to reach out to your legislators, let them know about the work you're doing, get to know them, and don't assume that they're your enemy. They could be an ally. So ask what their position is. Start a dialogue with them, but be sure they know about you and the work you're doing in the community.
We appreciate that, Tsiporah. Thank you. From human to human, let's have a discussion. Lily, how about your perspective? What are you thinking about this?
Well, I'm really happy that James, Terry, and Tsiporah went before I did, because I think they covered ground beautifully. And so the few things that I would add is that we too have been hearing from a number of other nonprofits and community-based organizations about concerns around transparency. That's always challenging in a special session. It's particularly challenging with the need to make sure that our volunteer legislators are safe, right? And that social distancing is practiced. So that is a part of what's going into it, trying to keep folks who do this on a voluntary basis safe as well, and their families and their communities safe, as well as keep democracy healthy and safe. And so we worked with a group of organizations that put together some recommendations about ways that transparency could be increased. And we had over 30 organizations sign on, and some organizations have still been signing on. And I'm looking at James and Tsiporah and seeing that there are folks who are on this call who stood up and supported those recommendations, and really, really looking at transparency, not just as some esoteric, yes, let's have more sunshine, but really thinking about it with an equity lens as well. And what it takes to have transparency in different parts of the state are very different, that we need both remote web-based digital options as well as analog options, that we need even more clarity about when hearing schedules will be, because it's hard enough to navigate during a regular session when you can show up on a given day and, hey, I got there bright and early, got parking, la, 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 and boom, a committee meeting has been canceled, or it meets but can't really move forward because there's not quorum. So there were recommendations to that effect to address some of the things that are hard during a typical session to really avoid that, because now more than ever, not just because the nature of the decisions about what we pay for and how budgets are really values documents and really say not just what matters, but who matters. It's particularly concerning at a time when people's confidence in government's ability to kind of maintain a social contract on many levels, from the issues that we began the call with to the issues of how people are having access to the supports they need during a pandemic, right? So now more than ever, people need to have see a government as acting with legitimacy, and transparency is a big part of that. In terms of some of the nitty-gritty with kind of budget decisions in and of themselves, I think one of the things that we've been hearing is that our legislative and executive branch are in an interesting place of trying to figure out revenue. So while the LFC has made many projections that are causing folks to look at drawing back some of the additions that were made to budgets and the increases that were made to budgets across departments during the regular session, There's also just questions about how will federal relief money be spent, and who gets to make those decisions? Are those decisions of the executive branch, or those decisions of the legislative branch? And not just who gets to spend it, but how do we spend it? How do we leverage those dollars? So I know that there have been a lot of meetings. So in terms of recommendations around advocacy, if there is something that you care about, it's important to not only talk to legislators, but talk to secretaries of the departments, talk to the LFC, figure out the logistics and the mechanics of how to access resources, help them problem solve, because they're trying to. And if you have content expertise because of your organization's mission or the relationships that you have in connection with a lot of other organizations, then by all means, be that technical assistance. You know, we don't only go in advocacy saying this is what I need, but also this is what I have to offer. And I think that's a really strong advocacy position to go in with. And I guess the other thing that I would just emphasize is that whether we are collectively advocating for a transparent and legitimate process that pays attention to equity, or we're advocating for specific policy asks that have dollar tags attached that we believe are going to most benefit New Mexicans, doing that together matters. When we go in without coordinated strategic policy asks, it's really easy to get played off. Not because anybody's being hateful, but when when a legislator or any decision maker is having lots of different information come their way, and folks aren't speaking in a coordinated way, then you get to choose. Hey, what's most compelling to me? If there's all these different options, what do I like? What do I think is going to play best with my constituents? And by all means, we should always be able to make the case of why what we're advocating for is good for a particular policymaker's constituents. When we have a more thought out set of options and more of us are, sharing the same story, sharing the same analysis, sharing the same solutions, those solutions have more weight. And to Tsiporah's point, the time is now. Those decisions have been in the works. And so part of why the special session is going to be able to go so quickly is because a lot of those decisions are being baked now. So yeah, definitely reach out to legislators, but reach out to department leadership and reach out to LFC as well, because they'll also be influencing the decisions that are made. And let the governor know what your policy priorities, because this is the long game. There's some immediate needs, but these immediate needs aren't going to just go away. And so we need to be thinking forward to what's going to be happening in interim committees as well as the regular session.
Thank you, Lily. I think it's totally fine that you went after them. This is really incredible information. And so, Alice, I wonder if you have anything to add about what you're expecting from the session, but more specifically, is there anything that Taos nonprofits need from their state governor or from our state leaders in this session?
I haven't heard a common voice for what would be needed as a group, but I think everyone has a lot of needs related to the session, and I would just go the route that everyone was expressing, that it's going to be important to reach out to the legislators and departments, as Lily mentioned. And I think there's work to be done here to kind of gather the voice of everyone. As I'm listening to everyone, I'm realizing that as for now, I'm not aware of something common, of a need that would be expressed, and I think that would be really beneficial to put that out there. So I don't know yet, but hopefully I'll get that together and put that forward.
Sure, yeah, thank you very much. And I encourage you to do that, and it's not always an easy thing, but I feel like we're all sort of in rush mode right now, and when Tsiporah says now is the time, that's no joke. So I want to encourage you all to, if you would, our panelists, put your contact information and the name of your organization in the chat so that people here might be able to reach out to you outside of this, and go ahead and put any other comments or questions people might have. And now I'll turn it over to Robert for our next session, our next question.
Awesome. Thanks, Mariah. That was a really great part of our discussion. We're going to dig into a little bit more. So our next question for our panelists is, So what are the big bucket items that legislators will be tackling at the special session? We've heard a little bit of it from that previous answers, but I kind of want to dig into more of like what priorities are, like what do people think their agendas are, and just kind of talk a little bit more about what we can do or what we can expect in that regard. So James, why don't we start with you again?
Well, you know, I think in addition to the budget, very clearly they got to deal with the shortfall this year, and that can be handled, I think, through, you know, shifting around some expenditures or using the state's reserves to accommodate that budget gap. For the fiscal year that begins July 1st, you know, the story is a little bit more difficult, and it really depends upon what was implied earlier, and that's how the use of the federal funds can be lawfully made, meaning that the state received about $1.2 billion in Federal CARES Act dollars. Those have some real significant limitations on them right now. We have heard through our national networks and from many others that there's a possibility that those restrictions could be eased. That would be vitally important for New Mexico in particular to be able to deal with you know, the shortfall that it is estimated to be, you know, 1.4 to maybe even over $2 billion. So I think that that's going to be a critical part of it. There are some other pretty important issues that are being raised that I'm not sure are going to be addressed. One is has to do with how we get money out to people. What business needs right now is customers. Customers need money to spend. And the best thing that our state can do is to actually get money into the hands of average New Mexicans then who can create the demand for business goods and services that keep these businesses going. So that's one really important aspect of it. The second part is small business assistance. We know that there's hundreds, maybe thousands of New Mexico businesses that are hurting that didn't get help from the federal acts. I think the state has a responsibility to step up and help these businesses, and there are some really interesting ideas being promoted right now. Representative Damon Eli, for example, has a proposal regarding the use of the severance tax permanent fund. I think it's a really creative idea. And then the third, I think, big area needs to be housing. You know, we're potentially facing a real housing crisis in New Mexico if we don't figure out a way to make sure that people are not going to lose their houses or be evicted if they can't afford to pay the rent. And I think that that's a real risk that we are facing as we look over the next couple of years. So I think that the fiscal year 21 budget that begins July 1st can be handled in a reasonable way without doing the kind of slashing of programs and services that Tsiporah mentioned. But you know, it's going to take courage on the part of legislators to do that. We need to bolster that courage.
Thanks, James. I appreciate that little dive, that deep dive. Lilly, we're going to go to you just to kind of check out what y'all are doing with New Mexico First.
Great. So I think James is absolutely right on. There's tremendous concern about the economy, and there's tremendous concern about basic needs, of which housing is one. I think what's challenging is that we're asking policymakers to make policy decisions using the budget around two things that might require different policy tools. We're not through the relief period. We are still in a pandemic, even though we're transitioning to easing public health restrictions for a variety of reasons, not all of which are health related, the easing of those restrictions. There's some very urgent and emergency relief efforts that are going on. And that's not experienced equally across counties or across government jurisdictions within New Mexico, right? And our tribal communities in New Mexico are disproportionately impacted in a negative way, are carrying an unfair burden. And so we need to be thinking about policy solutions that don't only work for the state, but work for the sovereign nations within our state as well, around basic needs. We also need to be thinking about recovery and what that looks like. And for some communities, they're ready for recovery, but others are not. There's much more relief that needs to be happening hand in hand with recovery. So one of the areas that we have worked in historically is around economic development that also includes kind of a community development perspective and family-friendly economic policy. And so we're, of course, always looking at that as in general and looking for policy strategies that move that historically consensus-backed agenda forward. And then in a more super concrete and tangible way, we have been doing work at the organization. I say we, like I said, I've been here a little shy of a year, but for about 7 years around resilient agriculture and local food systems, which also brings us to work cross-sector with folks who care about poverty and hunger and water security. And so we've again worked with several organizations. We started off with a policy work group of about 80 people. It's grown to a policy work group / groups of over 400 people. And that rapid growth has happened since March, where people are frequent flyers and co-creators of a policy agenda. And there are 3 different areas that we've worked on together in terms of both relief and recovery around eradicating food and water insecurity in New Mexico. And so one of the sets of policy priorities are really around addressing the root causes of food insecurity. And so really looking at our taxes and how they work, and looking at how public benefits are administered and the resources to do that. The second area is really around strengthening food and water relief efforts and using kind of existing infrastructure, both in the nonprofit and the government space to deliver those services. One of our most significant asks is $12 million for the food banks and their 500 members of that food bank system, because in the first month alone, Roadrunner, for example, spent over $1.2 million just in purchased food, which is well beyond what they're typically purchasing. They've, like, supply chains around donated food have been very unstable, and people's personal access to food has been very unstable, and institutional access to food has been very unstable, and the state has relied heavily on our food bank and pantry and kitchen system to get food to hungry people. And then, sorry to do the deeper dive there, and then the third area is really around investing in local food systems and agriculture, because we realize that when over 95% of your food comes from out of state and you can't compete in the national markets to access food supplies, that leaves a state like New Mexico very vulnerable and very much aware of our status as a colony, right, of the rest of the country. Like, that's not an unusual thing, but those disparities have been made super clear. So we know that part of our resilience overall and part of our both relief and recovery is going to be dependent on having more control of food production. So we've got to invest in that if we want that to work in an environment that's challenging to grow and produce food in. So those are a few things.
Thanks, Lilly. That's a very good point. I know the folks at Roadrunner Food Bank have been doing a lot of really amazing work, but I feel like there's this cascading effect right now with the pandemic. And I know, Terry and I work at the collective, so I'm gonna bounce to Terry to kind of talk about a little bit more of this deep dive into what we can expect from the kind of big bucket items from the legislative session.
I think, thank you, Robert. The other thing to keep in mind is response to federal funding that's coming down. So you have really a massive, I can't, outside of the stimulus program, the last time around, there hasn't been this much broadband money floating around, and distance learning and telemedicine funding. So if you're a nonprofit in the business of providing health services or distance learning services online, like, now is the time to be looking for equipment and funds for that equipment, or to bolster the lines coming into your office, or whatever it might be. And the state, I think, wants to take a more strategic role in deploying some of that funding on the broadband side. And I know some legislators wanted to introduce bills that use some funds, extra funds, to match some of that federal broadband funding that's out there. We talked to CYFD last week about their interest in rebuilding the children's mental health system in the state. And there's a lot of SAMHSA funding that comes out of the CARES Act. And so there's some strategic work that has to be done to figure out how to leverage money that's out there at this next session. And then I think the other thing to keep in mind too, to kind of keep everybody encouraged on what's going on in response. You know, we've already been through, I don't know, 8 weeks of this, 10 weeks of this, and the state has already tried a few things. You know, they tried a 6% interest loan program for small businesses, and you can imagine where that went at 6%. And so now they're rolling out 0%, and now they're rolling out loan guarantees and all sorts of different things. So it's very fluid too, and understand that just because it doesn't get done at the session doesn't mean it won't get done maybe 2 weeks later in an administrative way. So you can still advocate for stuff and a direction for things where you want it. You hear a lot of people talking on the call today about using the budget to meet various social goals and things that we're trying to achieve. The same is true for everything the legislature is doing, is think of it holistically and how you can move them overall in the direction you want to take them. You know, the state economic development department is going to be putting in for a major grant with the feds to do an economic recovery effort housed out of that department. They'll need some state match money to do that, but you know, what does that effort look like? What should it look like? How should it evolve? You know, those are places where you can have some input on that. So there's a lot rolling out of these federal pieces of legislation. You know, just last week we worked on a couple grants for local police and sheriff's departments to provide personal protective equipment to their officers and to people in their detention centers, and to clean various facilities that they had. And that was federal money designated just for specific towns and counties that they weren't going after, which was kind of crazy. So when you think about the risk of people in detention for COVID, to get them masks seems like a very logical thing to do, but some of these counties and cities don't even have the funds to do that. And the feds made dedicated funds available, but our municipalities and counties weren't applying for them. So really, you know, being aggressive about pursuing the funding that's out there and getting it deployed. So when SAMHSA comes out with a bunch of community mental health funding, we as a state need to figure out, how do we spend the federal government's money? There's no doubt we have mental health and behavioral health needs in this state that are overwhelming at times. So we ought to be figuring out a way to draw down every single dollar we can. So there's lots of pots of money. The governor had access to 4 different federal education funding streams out of the CARES Act, some that were discretionary, some that were competitive, you know, some that were automatic. So if you're in the education field, you ought to be talking to your legislator and the governor about where you want those funds to go. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen, and just keep in mind that it's going to keep morphing and changing. And it's really, I think, you know, to put another kind of positive spin on it, it's a real opportunity to get your, you know, big ideas out there. And we're hearing some of those from nonprofits, where nonprofits are saying, you know, maybe it's the time to do that thing we always wanted to do, and we just could never get to it, or we didn't see the impact or whatever. Well, now it's obvious that this is the time to really shift our thinking on this particular issue or whatever. We're hearing a lot of that, which is really incredibly positive to me, to see some inspirational thinking around new ideas and new approaches to things. And, you know, who knows, there might be some willingness at the legislative side, governor's office, and the federal side to try something new and different and make a big leap forward on an issue or two. So keep that in mind too, that a lot in the world is changing. So that is always, in my mind, an opportunity of some sort. So, use this time of change to advance something that you're passionate about.
Thanks, Terry. I appreciate it. We're going to hop over to Tsiporah just to talk about this question about what big bucket items legislators will be tackling at the upcoming session.
Okay, so I think that James and Lily and Terry talked about most of them. I've heard there may be some legislation around elections in November to provide funding for vote by mail and some increased authority for the Secretary of State around that. But what I really wanted to say is that as nonprofits, we are experts. We all have expertise about our communities. We work with them every day. And so you have insights that those legislators don't. And you need to be sharing that expertise with them. So tell them how lack of broadband is affecting your community. Tell them, the housing needs, the food needs, the water needs. Use your voice, use your expertise, and share that knowledge. And I think that's a great way to partner with legislators to provide on-the-ground, frontline information. And that's what I wanted to say, so thanks.
Thanks, Tsiporah. I appreciate that. Alice, do you want to add anything on this line? We're talking about any big bucket items that people might be wanting over there in your community.
Well, I think that all the big items have been mentioned already, as far as I know and what I've heard. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how the community here is going to respond to that, because there has been a project going on lately of mapping the grant money and the state funding and the county funding so that people can work together. And I think that in this time where the funding is evolving and shifting, it's going to be interesting to see how everyone is working together to get these funds to the organization that can benefit the most from it and move forward the most within the group.
Thanks, Alice. I appreciate that. I'm going to lift this one question up that I noticed in the chat, and this is just this maybe just for you, Terry, but I saw it from Ona. Have any of you heard about the potential of state grant timeline modifications given the virus's impact?
Yeah, and James might know about that as well. Yeah, I mean, we have heard that, and I think it's going to be agency by agency. And what we advise with state and the feds is whoever you're working with, whatever agency you're talking to, you be in contact with them regularly, really, and ask them for updates and changes. And like I said, last week we were on the phone with 2 different state agencies, and they are making lots of changes. Kind of every other day, it sounds like, trying to do new stuff and, shift things around. So you want to be on top of that as a nonprofit as best you can and check in with them and see where they're going. Like I said, I mean, CDBG, a great example. So many communities use that program. They are trying to shift and alter and change how they do that work. If you have not finished your CDBG yet, I've heard they've issued a letter if you haven't finished your project and trying to pull those funds back. So that's a deadline impact right there. But each agency is probably going to do it differently. So I would just stay in contact with them.
Thanks, Terry, I appreciate that. Mariah, I'm just going to kick it over to you to ask the next question.
Sure. So we've been talking about some of these big bucket issues, and I like that there's some clarity around what those biggest issues might be. So now let's talk about what the barriers that you guys see to these items being passed. If you do see barriers, what's the barrier to managing the budget and to dealing with specific needs of our community right now? Lily, I'll start with you.
So I think the biggest barrier is money, right? And then political will around how that's spent. And so what's interesting is while there's some common ground on this call about what some of the budget priorities are, I think one of the biggest barriers is the baseline. We have a lot of unmet need in New Mexico, right? We have highest hunger rates. I'm not trying to be gloom and doom, but we all know, right? We know the statistics. We know where we live, and that when you have those kinds of challenges systemically across communities in New Mexico pre-pandemic, and then you are stretched and over leveraged during a pandemic to do more with less, that capacity to like step back and leverage additional resources to help achieve those needs, I think is a challenge that not only nonprofits are experiencing, but we're in parallel with our government partners around that. They're also trying to figure out how to leverage more with less, and still take advantage of emerging opportunities. And so I think what we don't lack is resourcefulness and creativity and the ability to come together to problem solve. I think we're really good at that in New Mexico. I think it's often just a people power issue and how many hours are in the day. So again, the more that we can partner together with folks, other NGOs, but also with government partners to try to problem solve, I think the better we're going to be in terms of being able to use resources strategically, both in the legislative budget and also in terms of how relief dollars that are directed by the executive branch and how they're directed.
James, let's talk about some barriers you might see.
Yeah, New Mexico, despite a lot of the rhetoric that you might have heard during campaign season, we are a fiscally conservative state. We really are. And we have not sort of been bold about investing in children and families in the way that it's going to provide the kinds of opportunities for people to thrive. So I think that is absolutely a barrier. And we see that particularly in the finance committees in the legislature. The Senate Finance Committee in particular I think it's very proud of their sort of fiscal conservatism, but I believe it very much is a barrier to the ability for a state government to kind of continue to be an engine of getting money out the door and keeping people employed in communities large and small all across this state. So that's one barrier. A second barrier is, and I'm going to preface this by saying that I worked for the Legislative Finance Committee for over 5 years. I worked in Department of Finance and Administration for about, 8 or 9 years. But I will tell you that the staff of the fiscal agencies are very much out of touch with the on-the-ground reality that nonprofits deal with on a day-to-day basis. They really are. That doesn't make them bad people. It's just not their world. And we have a responsibility as in the nonprofit community to be lifting up the lived conditions, because that is not the world that they live in. They know the numbers in the columns. They know the state finance laws. And thank goodness we have really smart people in both the legislative and executive branches doing that work. But it very much is a barrier that they don't understand that those decisions that they make, how deeply that they impact our communities all across the state of New Mexico. They hear a bit of it from their legislative bosses or their executive branch bosses, but you can really get consumed as a staffer by the importance of the numbers in the columns and lose sight of the implications that has for people's lives. And I can tell you that I was absolutely guilty of that during my time working both the executive and legislative branches. So use your voices, make your voices heard at all different levels. It's really vitally important that you do. I just wanted to make one quick comment on what Terry was mentioning about the possibility, on Ona's question on the grants. Yeah, I've heard exactly the same thing. I think Terry nailed it. And I would tell you, if you have a need to adjust your grant timeline, communicate that early and often to make sure you get a response on it.
Thank you for that, James. Tsiporah.
Well, I think the barriers have been identified. Money and political will, particularly on the finance committees. And I am not sure how one breaks through that, except perhaps at the ballot box. It's important to talk with legislators, and while those two committees hold a lot of power, ultimately those decisions are taken to the floor, the House and Senate floor. And so if you've talked with your legislator, your representative and senator, and told them the reality and how those decisions impact their communities, that will help. So I guess that's my strategy, is again, just to reach out to your representative and senator and let them know how their decisions will affect the communities you serve and their constituents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you make a good point. Direct connection, which I think addresses maybe some of the questioning the political will also. And the fiscally conservative concept can be challenged also. James, I like that. Lilly, go ahead and, oh no, I think you opened us up, right? Okay, where are we at? Let's see, maybe I'll give Terry a moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mariah. The only other thing I would add or emphasize a little bit is the barrier of or communication barriers, maybe is the best way to put it. We have a project where we're helping the 70 grantees of the Thornburg Foundation and Quorum Foundations with assistance during COVID and reaching out to them and figuring out what they need. And I can say I've done some of those calls, and Robert has done some of those calls, and some of our other staff. And it really is enlightening to hear what they're doing. And a lot of these nonprofits that I thought were doing one thing were actually doing something totally different, or one of their programs that I didn't think had much of an impact actually had a huge impact. And so telling your stories is just so crucial. And I think we have a lot of assumptions about what we're all doing and what the impact is, but it needs to be communicated just over and over and over again. And then I would say the other side of the communications equation is talking to and listening to other voices. I am really struck at this time the difference in dialogue that communities are having across the state. And when I'm having a conversation like this in Albuquerque, you know, I can have one in Carlsbad and it seems to be completely different. So there is a gap there somewhere. We could probably spend hours and hours discussing why that is or whatever, but clearly there's a gap and we're not understanding one another sometimes. And so we just have to keep on talking and communicating. You could say educating or sharing information, whatever it is, to really get our point across. So I am always a big fan. You know, I remember this from, I used to work for Senator Bingaman, and he had a policy that we talked to everybody that came to the office, you know, despite their beliefs and their party or whatever. And that has always served me well and I've seen other people use it too. Just, you know, find that person that maybe you're not so comfortable talking to at first glance and have a conversation with them about what you do and why it's so impactful, and find out what they do and find out their perspective. And, you know, what we need at this time is the state to try to be coming together as one, not to be divided and say, you know, the Central Valley or whatever, Santa Fe and Albuquerque's got it right, other folks don't or whatever. You know, we really have to be looking out for each other. And I think it's really good for us to have those conversations outside of our normal circles and share information as best we can. And then you really get to a point where you're having a larger, broader impact or potential impact.
Invest in your voices. Absolutely. Thank you, Terry. Alice, if there's anything else you want to add, please do. We wanna make sure that everybody here understands that each other is a resource too. And just for clarity, Alice, before you help wrap us up on what you see to barriers in addressing some of the issues that your organizations and nonprofits are seeing. Everybody in the chat, there are a few questions that have been posed that we might not get to as a panel today. If any of you have answers for those, feel free to post them there. Alice, go ahead.
All right. Well, I guess that as far as addressing the barriers, which are like the finances and the political will, what all the panelists have said so far seems to be really relevant. And in Taos, I think an important key for that is going to be to express and to have a common voice to share within this community what's going on and who's doing what and how that can have an impact on the budget that's coming up. But that's just very much along the lines of what has been expressed so far.
Thank you. Okay, Robert, go ahead.
Thanks, Mariah. Our next question we're going to combine, so it's kind of a dream question. So the pandemic has exposed so much inequity, and actually, those inequities have been alive and well for a long time. Talked a little bit about them here earlier in our panel. So the question we have is compound. So what changes would you like to see? Would like to see in our communities coming up after this special session, beyond the special session? What changes would you like to see in our communities, and how can nonprofits advocate for those changes? And Tsiporah, I'm going to start with you. We can.
What changes would we like to see in our communities? So this is not a special session thought. This is long-term. So the special session is limited. It's only going to deal with the budget and what's on the governor's call. But we can be thinking now for the session in 2021 where more of these issues will be addressed. And we need to start thinking now and start working on it now. So I think it's time for a discussion of universal basic income. That's a big idea that would help all the residents of New Mexico. I know that there has been a study about a Medicare for all, or a Medicare buy-in or Medicaid buy-in, and that report is due, I believe, later this year, and it will be the second or third time that study has been done. And Senator Jerry Ortiz-Pino said that the last times that it was done, it always showed that it's cheaper to provide health care for everyone than to have this piecemeal system that we have. And he is likely to propose another iteration of health care for all. We also need to look at infrastructure projects. It's time to do FDR kinds of investments and tap the land grant permanent fund. It cannot be touched in a special session, but it can be done in a regular session. And tap that fund, invest in a meaningful way in early childhood education and education. And James, I'm stealing a little of your thunder there. But also do major infrastructure projects. We need broadband throughout New Mexico. It's not okay that people don't have access to the internet. It would benefit education, economic opportunity, telehealth, service delivery. It's a necessity. It's a utility in the 21st century. So I can go on for a while yet. We also need to figure out water and regenerative agriculture, and they're tied. There's been a water project, and Lilly can correct me on this, to pipe water to the Navajo Nation. I think it's been going on or delayed for 50 years. It's time just to get it done. It's past time to get it done. And because of things that have happened, we have soil erosion. That soil erosion is blowing soil from New Mexico to the mountains of Colorado and causing the snow caps to melt a month or more earlier, which has an impact on the watershed here in New Mexico. So if we implement regenerative agriculture on a massive scale, we help the soil to retain more water, which would stop that topsoil from blowing away, which would protect the headwaters, which ultimately protects our watershed. And I think that nonprofits, with their expertise, their community understanding, need to be involved in these dialogues. We need to be working together, and we need to be working with our legislators. And I will now get off my soapbox and let somebody else have a turn.
Thanks, Tsiporah. I appreciate that. James, if you could talk a little bit about what you'd like to see change and how can we advocate better for those changes?
Sure. That's a huge question, as Tsiporah just laid out. But you know, I think that this issue of infrastructure is vitally important. I'm not going to say much about it because Terry is much more knowledgeable about that than I am, and I think he could really be informative on that. But I agree entirely with Tsiporah's assessment that the lack of broadband infrastructure is very much a barrier to economic vitality in our state. And our state and city governments need to think about it in the context that they think about roads and water and sewer services. It's all part of making the private economy, helping to make it more efficient and productive. So that's one thing. The second is many of us are talking about what does a post-pandemic economy look like in New Mexico. As we've seen, you know, who is bearing the brunt of the issues related to not just the pandemic, but now the recession that is hitting New Mexico and could hit it even much, much harder. It's been reported today that unemployment is at its highest rate ever. That's really problematic. There's a good chance it could get much worse if we are not really thoughtful about making sure that we are continuing to get money out there into the economy and being spent. But how long are we going to continue to rely on oil and gas to be such a overwhelmingly significant part of our budget? That has to change. And that's not a short-term project. I know that there are some conservation or environmental-based foundations that are interested in that work. And, you know, my message to them has been, yes, but if you want that to change in New Mexico, you need to invest for the long run, because that is not a one-off project. We're not going to make significant progress in changing our over-reliance on really volatile oil and gas revenues if we don't invest over a long term. So I think that that's vitally critical. And the third thing I would mention is that we in this state, I don't think I've ever had an honest conversation about race and ethnicity. And I think it's time that we do that. It's past time that we do that. We've had this false narrative about three cultures in our state. Our state has never been about three cultures. The Navajo people are so very different than the Pueblo people. The Spanish people that came to this part of our world in the 15 and 1600s are very different than the Mexican immigrants. And I'm descended from both. But we've not been honest about even recognizing the contributions that African Americans have played in our state. We've ignored our Asian community. So I think it's time that we, as the nonprofit sector, help lead those discussions, because it's not going to happen from the politicians. It's way too difficult and dicey of an issue for them. They're very, very scared of it. And I think that we need to have the courage to lead on that. recognizing the internal work that's required and the external work that's required. It can't be just external, it's also got to be internal, and recognize how we have incorporated sort of white supremacy culture in the way that we think about our organizations, the way that we think about our lives, the way we think about our staff. So those are my three big thoughts.
Thanks, James. I appreciate that. As someone who has experienced tricultural myth every single day of my life here in New Mexico, I appreciate that you lifted that up. Asian Americans are also not just Asian. They're over like 150 different cultures, languages, dialects, you name it. We're not a monolith, and I appreciate that. Also just mentioning the Black lives too. Alice, we're going to shift to you. What changes would you like to see, and how can we advocate for those changes?
From what I've been hearing in Taos, and again, I'm just going to talk from what I hear here, there have been a few main issues that have been identified and that people are trying to advocate for. So I'm just going to relay these. There's a big part about housing, and I think it's going to be even more of an issue soon with the end of the lease. I don't know how you say it, but like the fact that people were not paying their rent potentially, and they might be evicted from their homes. I think that's going to be a big issue here in Taos, and I'm sure elsewhere in New Mexico. There's also been a lot of talk about the access to the internet, as some of you mentioned already, and I think that's obviously an important part of what could help economic development and access just to infrastructure and health here in Taos. And the other two were the food system, the food network, and someone, I don't remember when, was talking about how the network of local agriculture needs to be tightened. I think that's one of the things that folks here in Taos are trying to focus on and move forward. And I think that state and county support would be really beneficial for that. And finally, there was a big part about behavior health, and I think that's something that has an impact over all of New Mexico, and really implement public programs and services that help not only nonprofits but also like doctor and public institutions to move forward with the population of New Mexico. So that would be the 4 highlights of what I'm hearing here in Taos that would be important to advocate for as far as the state goes.
Alice. I'm going to shift over to Lilly, and then we'll go to Terry last for this question.
Thanks. So one of the things that I'm struck by when I kind of imagine what's possible is I look at what we do in really difficult situations, right? Because sometimes our most creative, responsive, people-centered ways of being together come through in a hard time. And so when I think about some of the things that I've, borne witness to or been a part of since the pandemic, one thing is just how, when it comes down to it, both philanthropy and government have shown the capacity to partner better with private, not-for-profit, and for-profit organizations to make sure that basic needs are being met, or to at least endeavor to meet needs. That being responsive, creative, and people-centered, has come through with rapid cycle application processes, so folks aren't having to jump through as many hoops. So if we can do that during this time, let's acknowledge that there's always some baseline challenge here, right? And we don't have to be in a pandemic to have systems that work better, that take less capacity from folks to make a case that there can be accountability and collaboration and a level of respect and trust that we're seeing right now. That could be our new baseline, right? That would be a super cool new normal. I think the other thing that we need to do, and this is to James's point, and others have made it as well, is, part of how we operationalize our commitments around equity are about both personal and organizational work and cross-organizational work. And to ask ourselves always, who's not at the table? and not just as from a deficit, like, oh, they're not here, for them, because that's not respectful. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I'm suggesting is that we miss assets. Some of the most brilliant collaborations that I've seen have come from organizations that don't even have a 501c3 status. They came together to create relief efforts, and they are feeding and getting water and hygiene products to people in their community, hundreds of people in their communities, week after week after week, when the typical nonprofit network and the typical government network could not. That to me is super inspiring. So when we don't have those folks at the table, then we miss assets and resources to be problem solving together. So there is definitely an equity ethic underlining it. And there's also a very pragmatic, like if we lose half the wisdom of the state in our problem solving, boy, we're in trouble. We need more people. And so that's on all of us to ask who else, and then not to just ask and contemplate, but to then go out and build that relationship and make room at the table for one another. And I guess I won't pick one particular policy issue that I would like to see change, because they're all interconnected. So whether we're talking about economic and community development, or natural resources, or education, or health, or good governance, at the heart of doing all of those things better are doing those things without the window dressing of collaboration and consensus, but with allowing space for dissent, because again, it started with that, but that's what tells us who's not at the table or who hasn't been at the table enough, because their wisdom about what's needed isn't yet common knowledge. And so we have to talk to Terry's point, with folks who we're not always comfortable talking with. And we have to have conversations in ways that we're not always comfortable having conversations, which is we don't tiptoe around our values. We don't tiptoe around disparities, and we don't tiptoe around the structural racism, classism, sexism, homophobia that underlies that, right? We have to, if we don't address those things, we're going to find ourselves in the next pandemic with people needlessly dying for things that there's no reason why we can't get it together to get people water and food. There's no reason why we can't get it together to get people access to healthcare, except that we don't love each other enough. And that's shameful. And we can do better. Sorry.
Thanks, Lily. I appreciate that. I think vulnerability is powerful, and it's something that we need to value as much as we can. It's also part of breaking down a lot of those barriers around race, around structural oppression, all those things. So I appreciate that very much. Terry, we're going to round out with you and what you would like to see change, and how can we advocate for that?
It's hard to follow all the good thoughts that folks have had, but I'll just emphasize a couple. I agree with the points on infrastructure. I think it'd be nice if our infrastructure approach was equitable, and we did things like, we don't prioritize our highway funding by the communities that have the greatest need, in a sense. We do it by economics, or we do it by, how many trucks roll on that highway. But do we ever say to people of Rama need a better road because they need to get to health services? And so equitable thoughts about infrastructure would be a better way to approach it. And then also, a post-pandemic economic plan. We have not had an economic development plan in the state since the Richardson administration. So I love all the talk that people have about, we need jobs, but we really don't have a strategy on that. Do we want people to work at Burger King? Do we want them to work in the trades? Do we want them to work, in energy? What is the, strategy? We kind of have a laissez-faire, strategy towards the economy. Whatever we get, we get. If we get Topgolf to come to Albuquerque, fantastic. If we get 1,000 jobs from Amazon like we did last week, great, we'll take it. We just take whatever somebody sends us. And that's not a real strategy. So I'd like to see that come out, some of this. Some of the changes I'm seeing that I want to continue to see that are so encouraging is in our calls to nonprofits. We're finding these nonprofits suddenly working with other nonprofits they had never worked with before. and a lot of barriers getting broken down and misperceptions and misconceptions of things. And it's kind of exciting. Like the Santa Fe Food Depot said, all of a sudden a bunch of farmers showed up that we didn't even know existed to give us food. I mean, that kind of stuff is great. And so I think we're seeing these new associations, new, marriages in a sense between organizations to get stuff done. It's what is, in a sense, a positive result of a crisis, is that people put aside a lot of other stuff and just get down to doing business and making things work, which is a great change, and hopefully something we continue to see. And then my little altruistic idea, since everybody's sharing them, is I'd like to see people get more involved in government. We talk about how government doesn't move fast enough and we want to see change. And a lot of that talk is just telling government, why don't you fix it? But I myself don't want to join government to fix it. I want you to fix it because that's what I elected you to do. Well, we're having a hard time getting people to serve in government and to serve on commissions. And I know there's a lot of ickiness there and a lot of, I don't want to get my hands dirty in government, or it moves too slow, or, it's a waste of time, or it's old fashioned. Government's not going anywhere, as far as I can tell. And we don't have enough people under, let's say, 40 that want to be on the school board, that want to be on a commission, that want to run for office, as tough as that might be. And they need to do it. I mean, we need those ideas. People who get called up into service, a lot of them are upwards in age. And it's and you see them going back into service over and over because it was important to them in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. And I was raised in government service, and all my family served in government, so that's why I did it before I went to the nonprofit sector. But maybe people that aren't as comfortable being in government should be there and get your hands dirty, learn the system. And it's not the trendiest thing these days, but I think that's where, you can really have a humongous impact. And I think that would be a change that I would love to see. I look at my kids who are teenagers now, and they want to know why this crisis is happening and what can be done about it and what can be done in the future. And I tell them, government pulls the strings. If you want to make the changes that you want to see, please, after you're out of college or after you're out of high school or whatever, do something in government. And I think that would be a change that transforms the state in so many ways. And a lot of the issues we've talked about today, we can make progress on those if we can get new voices working in government. So that's my big idea.
Thanks, Terry, I appreciate that. It is 10:21. I know we said we'd try to do some Q&A, but we wanted to do something very briefly. So I'm going to kick it over to Mariah really quick so we can get start transitioning and closing down.
Well, Terry, I think your last answer was really helpful to transition to this last question. And you may have already given me your answer, so I will go backwards and start with you. Our question, how we always wrap up in Impact and Coffee, is what can our community do for you today? How can people be helping from home? What are creative ways that people can be supporting your organizations in this legislative experience and or advocating in new ways? So Terry, if there's anything else you want to add, and check mark, kudos to voting and getting involved.
Yeah, and make sure everybody votes today if they haven't already. So as far as our organization is concerned, we are trying to finance those really good ideas that are out there and get financial backing. So where you see something that is, going to really push the state forward, and you're looking for that funding influx that's needed for that idea, we're starting to hear more and more of those, and that's fantastic. So where there's something good happening, alert us to it, and we might be able to find a funding source for it, myself or Robert at the Grants Collective. So that's one thing I'd like to see, is where something is working, how do we back it? Like, how do we encourage it and foster it, move it along? and make sure it doesn't fall astray in a sense. So we gotta back those good ideas and those good efforts out there. And if people need that support financially, they should let us know. And then also, if there's any lack of capacity on grant writing or finding grants, that's what we do as well. So we're happy to serve on that end too.
Thank you very much. Lily, how about you? What can we all do for you today?
So if you haven't already signed on to recommendations around the special session and good governance, it's not too late. We've already sent kind of a direct we've sent a direct communication to legislators, but we will be following up. And so if your organization or you as an individual person hasn't signed on, you're certainly welcome to. I've shared the link for it in the chat, but if you email me at lily@nmfirst.org, I'm happy to send you that link so you don't have to go back and find it in the chat. The second thing is, if you care about food security and water security issues and think that there's a compelling reason for a cross-sector approach, with some of the usual and unusual suspects being a part of doing problem solving together, be happy to tell you more about our coalition-based policy agenda around that and how you can advance that in the session. Both this one and moving forward, because it's not one and done kind of work. The third thing is, we ended up having to postpone our town hall, which brings together many stakeholders from around New Mexico. The good news is that we'd been out doing community conversations beforehand and already starting to build consensus. And so we're reaching out to, so we had about 10 of those community conversations. We're going to be doing 18 more because in some ways remote, you know, there are trade-offs. I miss being with people, but the advantage is people can join in by phone or computer. But we will be still doing a town hall, but we'll be doing it remotely in August, and we're focusing on health, body, mind, and spirit. So both looking at primary care and behavioral and mental health. And nobody who's coming to the table thinks they have all of the solutions, but together with many, many communities represented, we're smart, resourceful people, right? We can figure it out. And so if you want to be a part of that, and if you're wanting to have more support around helping people have principled, hard and fierce and important conversations, we really want to help folks build capacity around doing that in a nonpartisan way. So if any of those seem like things you want to be a part of or additional tools you want to enhance in your toolbox, be in touch.
Thank you, Lily. And if you have any links you can provide in the chat for how people can sign on to that or become part of the community conversations and whatnot, please feel free to put that there. Alice, how about you? Is there any way that our community can be supporting your work?
Well, I would say that definitely keeping on talking and sharing what's going on and bringing awareness not only to fellow folks that are working on the same projects, but also to individuals that may benefit from it or may want to support or become part of it. I think that would be the biggest thing, just to keep on communicating and therefore hopefully offer more collaboration and collective work. I think that would be the best way.
Thank you. Tsiporah, we'll take it to you, and then I'll have James wrap us up.
Okay, so I will just reiterate the same point. Call your representative and senator. Let them know who you are, the work you're doing in community. Share that expertise with them. Have a dialogue. It does two things. First of all, there's an exchange of information, but it also lets them know that you're paying attention. Sometimes they feel like they're working in a vacuum when they don't hear from people. So reach out to your state rep and senator, and the sooner the better. You can go to nmlegis.gov and look them up. You can, if you don't know who they are, you can look them up by your zip code. And they have phone numbers and emails there. We have a very accessible state house.
Perfect, thank you. James, we'd love to hear from you too. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for the opportunity to participate. I think the previous speakers have covered it all. Collective action, political advocacy work is vitally important. But I would also just tell everyone, just know that you're not alone and that there are lots of great resources. Even if we don't individually have the answer for you, maybe we can help steer you to find you the answers that you need. And along the lines that Alice mentioned, I think this notion of building our strength together, we can become a much more powerful movement. The last thing I would say is, help us have an honest conversation about race in New Mexico as we think for the future about not just the special session, but well into the future. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you very much. So I just want to remind people that there will be a link to this YouTube, and we are going to post any sort of resources and useful information from the chat as well and document. And I'll turn it over to Robert to wrap us up today, and I just want to thank you all for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mariah. And thanks to all of our panelists today. This has been a very, really great conversation, really great topics that were lifted up. I want to lift up again, too, that we do need to have some really authentic conversations about race and race equity and racial justice in our communities, especially after the week we've just had all across our countries. And so if you're looking to do something about that, there are a lot of Black-led organizations and nonprofits that are doing some really great on the ground right now. I encourage you to check them out, do some research, do some work. There are some folks on this call that I know who are doing some work as white supporters, as white friends of Black lives. So I know you're on this call, so check them out and hopefully help us do some of that emotional work, because people of color can't always bear the burden of racial equity work. It's up to white folks to align and support that work so that we can dismantle racism and white supremacy in our communities. Impact and Coffee is the first 3 Tuesdays of the month. The next one is next week. It's June 9th. We have a very great panel of folks working with homeless services. So our folks are Anita Cordova from Albuquerque Healthcare for the Homeless, Hank Hughes from the Coalition on Homelessness, and Edward Archuleta from St. Elizabeth's up in Santa Fe. So we're looking forward to that conversation, especially right now with our unhoused folks. It's important that we have those conversations too, not just at Impact and Coffee, but outside of this realm as well. Just want to say again, big thanks to our Impact and Coffee team, to Aaron, to Michael, to Destiny, to Juan, to Mariah, to Jamie, for all of your hard work. We love you. I love you. You're amazing folks. We put on this every single, first 3 Tuesdays of the month, doing some hard work. So it's really great. Big thanks to all of our folks that joined us this morning for this very special panel. I know a lot of you joined. It's really great to see all of you. And we'll see you next Tuesday. So have a really great rest of your week, and may all your lights be green. We'll see you soon.